The weight of the past was more than a metaphor. It was a physical gravity, a tangible link to 1,000 years of forgotten bloodlines. Freya's fingertips brushed the cold, pitted iron that reinforced the leather of the ancient codex. Her pulse thrummed in her wrists, a frantic, uneven beat. The saga of the unbroken king. This was the find of a lifetime, the centerpiece of her archival research and the key to the historical mystery she'd been obsessed with for years. The head of university special collections had looked at her with thinly veiled concern when she'd made the request, muttering about archaeological madness and the fever that took those who handled the iron-bound books. But to Freya, it wasn't a curse, it was just data. Misunderstood, neglected data. Her world was a place of sterile logic and silent archives. It was the low hum of the university's climate control, the soft scratch of her charcoal pencil, and the comfort of centuries pressed into ink. She was an Omega, yes, but in a world of skyscrapers and suppressants. That was a medical footnote, a recessive genetic quirk that affected a fraction of the population. It was a clinically silent part of her, a dormant spark she'd inherited from an ancestry no one talked about. Here, surrounded by the dead, she was simply a scholar. Her intellect was her fortress, her sanctuary. The book was unnaturally heavy, the iron bindings icy even through her gloves. She lowered it onto the velvet-lined foam cradle on the oak table, the absolute silence of the restricted vault pressing against her eardrums. With a steadying breath, she threw the latch. The air didn't just move, it curdled. The page beneath the iron cover wasn't vellum or parchment. It was a shifting rift of frost and shadow, runes carved in blue fire that seemed to pulse like a living heart. Her rational mind screamed that this was a hallucination, a glitch in her reality. But deep beneath her skin, the dormant Omega, the wild thing she had spent her life treating as a medical curiosity, jolted awake. It didn't just stir, it roared in recognition, a primal instinct she didn't know she possessed, clawing at the back of her mind. Don't touch it. But curiosity had always been her greatest strength, and her fingers were already sinking into the light. The transition was a violent upheaval of reality. One moment, Freya was enveloped in the sterile silence of the university vault. The next, she slammed into a solid, warm mass that smelled of cedar, old leather, and a sharp, metallic tang that set her teeth on edge. The air was no longer filtered and thin. It was thick with the smoke of tallow candles and the musk of a dozen unwashed, powerful bodies. She gasped, her fingers digging into the thick fur draped over the lap of whatever or whomever she had landed on. Above her, a roar of chairs scraping against stone erupted. "Sorcery!" a voice bellowed, vibrating through the floorboards. Freya looked up and froze. She was straddling the thighs of a man who seemed carved from the very mountains she had studied. His hair was the color of a winter storm, and his eyes, a piercing molten amber, held her with the predatory focus of an apex hunter. This was King Viggo, not the faded illustration from her thesis, but a living, breathing titan whose presence exerted a physical pressure on her chest. "A spy sent by Ragnar," another man shouted. This was General Gunnar, recognizable by the jagged scar across his cheek and the heavy executioner's sword he was already unsheathing. He moved with a speed that defied his bulk, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. "Move aside, sire. I will take her head before she can finish her incantation." Gunnar's blade rose, the firelight dancing off the edge of the steel. Freya's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But as the blade began its descent, the man beneath her moved. Viggo's hand shot out, his fingers catching Gunnar's wrist with a bone-cracking jar. The king didn't stand. He simply leaned forward, shielding Freya's smaller frame with his own. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, a sound no human should be capable of making. "Stay your hand." "Gunnar," Viggo commanded, his voice a low rumble that made the loose papers on the war table flutter. She is not a spy. Look at her eyes. There is no magic here, only the stars. She fell from the ceiling, Viggo, Gunnar hissed, his muscles straining against the king's grip. She is a threat. She is mine, Viggo countered, his scent suddenly shifting, deepening into something intoxicatingly sweet and heavy. She is marked. She is sacred. Anyone who touches her answers to my teeth. As the word mine echoed through the hall, a sudden searing heat bloomed in the pit of Freya's stomach. It was a localized fever, spreading through her veins with terrifying speed. The suppressants she had taken that morning felt like they were evaporating, stripped away by the sheer territorial power of the Alpha before her. Her breath hitched, coming in shallow, ragged puffs. The scent of him, the pine, the musk, the raw power, was no longer just an observation. It was a beckoning. Against her own will, Freya's head tilted back, exposing the sensitive line of her throat. Her modern mind screamed in protest, but her body was already surrendering to a biology she had spent her life pretending didn't exist. She was an Omega, and for the first time in history, she was in the presence of her king. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 2, where the ancient mage Astrid examines Freya and reveals the permanent nature of her arrival? The heavy silence that followed Viggo's declaration was broken not by the warriors, but by the rhythmic tap of a staff against the stone floor. From the shadows behind the high seat, a woman emerged, her presence cooling the feverish tension of the room. Astrid, the ancient mage of the court, moved with a grace that felt untethered from time, her robes the color of deep twilight, and her eyes milky with cataracts that clearly saw things the sighted could not. Viggo did not relinquish his hold on Freya, but his predatory stance eased slightly as the old woman approached. Astrid didn't look at the king. She leaned in close to Freya, her nose twitching as she inhaled the strange synthetic scent of university laundry detergent and the faint ozonic trail of the rift. She reached out a gnarled hand, her fingers ghosting over the high-tech weave of Freya's moisture-wicking hiking jacket and the plastic casing of the digital watch still strapped to her wrist. Threads woven by machines, not hands, Astrid whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. And a tongue that speaks our words with the cadence of a ghost. She turned her sightless gaze toward the iron-bound book, still lying open on the floor, its blue fire now a dying ember. She is not from the North, Gunnar, nor is she from any land that touches our seas. She is a traveler, a prophetess of ink, born from a time that has not yet come. Freya tried to find her voice, her throat dry and tight. I was in the library. I need to go back. There has to be a way to reverse the surge. The runes, they functioned as a bridge, but the energy displacement. Child, Astrid interrupted, her voice softening with a terrible kind of pity. She placed a hand over the glowing runes of the book. As she did, the light flickered once and vanished, leaving the iron cold and the pages blank. The bridge you crossed was a path of glass. It shatters behind the traveler to ensure the destination is met. The Debellis Fae does not grant returns. It only delivers what is required by the fates. The reality of the words hit Freya harder than the physical fall. The modern world, her thesis, her quiet apartment, the safety of her sterile logic, wasn't just miles away. It was effectively dead. A choked sound escaped her lips, and she felt the king's arm tighten around her waist, a grounding weight against the sudden vertigo of her grief. You speak in riddles, crone, Gunnar spat, though he lowered his sword. If she is a prophet, let her speak. What use is she to a kingdom about to burn? Astrid looked at Freya, her blind eyes seeming to pierce through to the girl's very soul. She does not bring magic, General. She brings the memory of what is to come. She is the anchor for a king who was meant to fall. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 3, where Freya interrupts the War Council to reveal the fatal flaw in Gunnar's strategy? Viggo did not let her go, but he shifted his weight, allowing Freya to slide from his lap to stand beside him. The sudden loss of his direct heat made the chill of the stone hall bite deeper, but the internal fire of her awakening biology remained a low, pulsing thrum in her blood. On the massive oak table lay a map of vellum and sheepskin, stained with wine and marked by heavy iron figurines. Gunnar pushed a group of tokens toward a narrow indentation on the map, the Serpent's Pass. "The logic is sound, sire," Gunnar barked, his voice echoing with the arrogance of a man who had never lost a theater of war. "We bottle them in the neck. We hold the high ground with the archers and let the terrain do the killing. By dawn, Ragnar's vanguard will be a carpet of carrion for the crows." Freya leaned forward, her eyes scanning the topographical lines hand-drawn on the skin. She knew this map. She had spent 3 years staring at a digitized version of it on a high-resolution monitor in the university's basement. She knew the names of every ridge, every sinkhole, and every drop of blood spilled on that soil. "You're going to die," she said, her voice small but clear in the cavernous room. The council went deathly still. Gunnar froze, his hand still hovering over the iron tokens. He turned his head slowly, his eyes flashing with a mix of disbelief and lethal insult. "What did you say, girl?" "The Serpent's Pass," Freya said, stepping closer to the table. Her modern sneakers squeaking softly on the stone. "It's a natural funnel, yes, but you haven't accounted for the limestone shelves on the eastern ridge. At this time of year, with the thaw, they are unstable. If you put 3,000 men on that height, the vibration alone will trigger a shelf collapse. You won't bottle Ragnar in. You'll bury your own archers under 1,000 tons of rock." Gunnar let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Limestone, vibrations. You speak the gibberish of a hedge witch. I have held that ridge in a dozen skirmishes." "Not with an army of this size," Freya countered, her academic fire rising to meet his steel. "And not during a spring thaw after a heavy frost. In the records, in the stories of my world, this is known as the Great Sorrow. You lose 5,000 men in 10 minutes. Ragnar doesn't even have to swing a sword, he just walks over your graves." "Enough!" Gunnar slammed his fist onto the table, the map jumping. "Sire, I will not have my strategy questioned by a slip of a girl who fell out of the air. She is a distraction, or worse, a plant to sow cowardice in our ranks." Viggo's gaze remained fixed on the map, his golden eyes tracking the lines Freya had pointed out. The scent of him sharpened, the smell of ozone and ancient pine, as he looked from his general to the strange woman with ink-stained fingers. The rift in the room was palpable. The warriors looked to Gunnar with loyalty, but they looked to Viggo with a primal, fearful hope. "The crone says she is a prophetess," Viggo mused, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "And I have never known the stones of the Serpent's Pass to be trustworthy in the rain." "You cannot be serious," Gunnar hissed. "You would choose the word of a stray over the wisdom of your general?" "I choose the path that keeps my people alive," Viggo replied, his hand coming down to rest over Freya's on the map. The touch was electric, a jolt of alpha dominance that made her knees weak, but his eyes held a budding, terrifying trust. The tension of the War Council still hung in the air like a gathering storm, but Viggo led Freya away from the stifling heat of the hall and toward the open sky. They climbed a winding stair of jagged stone until they emerged onto the high cliffs overlooking the Lykenos Valley. The wind here was a living thing, sharp with the scent of pine and the biting clarity of the northern ice. Freya shivered, her modern jacket proving a poor defense against the primeval cold, but before she could wrap her arms around herself, a heavy fur-lined cloak was draped over her shoulders. It was Viggo's own mantle. It carried his scent, that intoxicating mix of cedar and dominant alpha pheromones, and the heat from his body radiated through the heavy pelt. Freya reached up to clutch the collar, her modern sensibilities warring with the sudden, intense surge of protection she felt radiating from him. In her world, such a gesture might have felt patronizing or archaic, but here, under the shadow of a coming war, it felt like an essential shield. Viggo stood beside her, his silhouette cut like granite against the twilight sky. He didn't look at her. He looked out over the sprawling kingdom, a tapestry of dark forests, silver rivers, and the flickering hearth-fires of villages that didn't know they were being hunted. "Gunnar is a man of iron," Viggo said, his voice a low rumble that the wind couldn't carry away. "But iron is brittle. It breaks when it cannot bend. You gave him a truth he could not bend to." "I gave him a fact," Freya corrected, her breath hitching as Viggo stepped closer to block the wind. "In my world, we don't guess. We measure. We analyze." Viggo turned then, his amber eyes softened by the fading light. He reached out, his hand, large enough to crush her skull, moving with a rugged, unexpected tenderness. He didn't touch her face. Instead, he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his thumb ghosting over the sensitive skin of her temple. The contact sent a jolt through her system, a resonant frequency that made her Omega heart skip a beat. "You speak of your world as if it were a dream," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the pulse leaping in her throat. "But you are here now, Freya. You are flesh and blood, and you are under my sky." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small dried piece of honeycomb, offering it to her with the same careful gravity he might use to handle a fragile relic. Freya took it, her fingers brushing his. It was a simple raw gift, devoid of the polished chivalry of her own time. Yet it felt more profound than any grand gesture she had ever known. As she ate the sweet, waxy treat, she realized with a start that she wasn't just a strategist to him. He was courting her in the only way he knew how, with heat, with sugar, and with the silent promise of a predator guarding his mate. The confusion in her chest deepened, a beautiful, terrifying ache that suggested she was beginning to like the weight of his cloak more than the safety of her library. The fragile piece of the cliffside was shattered by the rhythmic, desperate pounding of hooves against the frosted earth. Freya and Viggo reached the courtyard just as a rider collapsed from his mount, his cloak shredded and his face smeared with the grey ash of the northern wastes. This was Eric, the king's most trusted scout, and the terror in his eyes was a sharp contrast to the stoicism of the warriors surrounding him. "The Serpent's Pass," Eric gasped, his voice cracking as he accepted a water skin. "The Horde. They didn't march through the valley floor. They've begun to scale the eastern ridge, just as the girl said. But sire, the earth is screaming. The heat of their fires and the weight of their iron are tearing the stone apart. I saw a fissure open wide enough to swallow a horse. If we had been there." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the courtyard. General Gunnar, who had emerged from the hall with his hand still resting on the hilt of his sword, looked as though he had been struck. The scoff he had prepared died in his throat as he stared at the scout, then at the map Freya had corrected, and finally at Freya herself. The hedge witch had been right. If they had followed his command, 3,000 of Lykenos' finest would currently be buried under a mountain of limestone. "They are moving faster than our songs predicted," Eric continued, his gaze drifting toward Freya with a mixture of awe and superstitious dread. "They have machines of war we haven't seen in centuries. Without her warning, we would be a kingdom of ghosts by sunset." The court shifted. It was a subtle tectonic movement of loyalty. The warriors, once skeptical and hostile, now looked at Freya with a desperate, burgeoning reverence. She was no longer just a stray who had fallen from the sky or a biological curiosity to be claimed. She was the only one who held the blueprint to their survival. The prophetess of ink was no longer a title of mockery, but a lifeline. Viggo stepped forward, his presence expanding to fill the courtyard, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, protective pride. He didn't need to speak to assert his dominance, but his hand found the small of Freya's back, a public declaration that she was the mind behind his throne. The records of her world are the only maps that haven't lied to us, Viggo announced, his voice carrying to the furthest watchtowers. Gunnar, burn your old scrolls. From this moment, we march by her word. Freya felt the weight of 1,000 lives settle onto her shoulders. She was a researcher, a woman of footnotes and quiet libraries, now tasked with the heavy, bloody reality of a war she had only ever read about. As the court bowed their heads in a silent collective plea for her guidance, she realized she wasn't just observing history anymore. She was the hand writing it. The march toward the Serpent's Pass was a symphony of iron and ice, a relentless rhythmic thud of boots that seemed to echo the racing of Freya's heart. When the sun finally dipped below the jagged horizon, the army settled into a temporary camp. A city of hide tents and flickering fires huddled against the encroaching dark. Because she was sacred, and because the Alpha's territorial scent had become a suffocating, protective cloud, there was no question of where she would sleep. She was led to the King's Pavilion, a space that smelled of cedar, cold steel, and the heavy, intoxicating musk that had been systematically dismantling her modern defenses since the moment she arrived. Inside, the roar of the wind was muffled, replaced by the crackle of a small brazier. Viggo stood by a chest, removing his heavy pauldrons. Without the armor, he seemed even larger, a landscape of scarred muscle and sun-darkened skin. Freya sat on the edge of the low cot, the fur blankets beneath her hands, feeling unnervingly like the pelts she had once only seen behind museum glass. "You are trembling," Viggo observed, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and strike directly at her marrow. He didn't approach her like a conqueror. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator, ensuring its mate wasn't startled. "It's the cold," Freya lied, her voice breathy. "Or the adrenaline. In my world, we don't march toward massacres. We don't feel things this loudly." Viggo crossed the space, kneeling between her knees. He reached up, his large hands framing her face with a reverence that made her breath hitch. The modern scholar in her tried to catalogue the sensation as a surge of oxytocin and pheromonal signaling, a desperate attempt to maintain her clinical detachment. But as his thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, the intellectual walls she had built over a lifetime simply crumbled. "Your world is a place of shadows and silence," Viggo whispered, his amber eyes glowing in the firelight. "Here, the heart is not a secret. You are my mate, Freya. Not because a book brought you, and not because you have the eyes of a seer, but because my soul recognizes the ink in your veins as its own." When he leaned in, the kiss wasn't a question. It was a homecoming. The moment their lips met, the clinically silent part of her biology exploded into a deafening roar. The omega heat, no longer a medical footnote, surged through her like liquid fire, demanding the claim she had been running from. As his teeth grazed the sensitive junction of her neck and shoulder, Freya stopped thinking about the history she was supposed to preserve. She reached for him, her fingers tangling in his hair, blending her modern heart with his ancient, rugged soul in the quiet dark of the tent. History could wait. For the first time, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The air at the Serpent's Pass didn't just bite, it screamed. As the grey dawn broke over the jagged peaks, the ground groaned under the weight of the encroaching Bloodfang horde. From her vantage point on the high ridge, standing within the protective shadow of Viggo's massive frame, Freya looked down at the landscape she had memorized from centuries-old sketches. The valley was a throat of stone, and Jarl Ragnar's army was the blade pressed against it. "They are moving exactly as the records described," Freya whispered, her breath blooming in the frozen air. The bond between her and Viggo pulsed with a newfound intensity, a psychic tether that allowed her to feel the coiled tension in his muscles. Below, Ragnar's vanguard hit the center of the Lykenos line, the clash of steel on steel echoing like thunder. Gunnar looked up at her, his helmet splattered with the first spray of blood. He waited, his arrogance replaced by a grim, desperate faith. "Now," Freya commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos. The records say Ragnar's strength is his pride. He has sent his heavy infantry through the gut, but his secret flank, the one that historically broke your line, is moving through the ghost path behind the frozen waterfall. Viggo didn't hesitate. He raised his hand, signaling the elite scouts hidden in the crags. "Heed the prophetess. Shift the reserve to the falls. Let them think the way is clear." The maneuver was a masterpiece of historical foresight. As Ragnar's elite flank emerged from the mist behind the waterfall, expecting a defenseless rear, they found themselves staring into a wall of Lykenos shields. The hidden path had become a slaughter box. Freya watched, her modern mind calculating the shift in momentum like a live data feed. She pointed toward a cluster of black banners moving toward the eastern shelf. There, Ragnar has realized the trap. He's attempting to withdraw to the high ground. If he reaches that ridge, he can regroup. He will reach nothing but his end, Viggo growled. He turned to her, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying, beautiful heat. He pressed his forehead against hers for a fleeting second, a silent, primal promise of return, and then he was gone, plunging into the fray with the roar of a true alpha. Caught in the crosshairs of Freya's tactical map and Viggo's physical fury, the invincible Jarl Ragnar was forced into a corner. The man who had been a nightmare in the history books was now just a trapped animal. Freya stood amidst the swirling snow and the scent of iron, realized she wasn't just a scholar of the war anymore. She was the architect of its ending. The ghost path had become Ragnar's tomb, and the timeline she knew was shattering, replaced by a victory that had never been written, until now. The valley floor was a churning vortex of mud, ice, and arterial spray. In the center of the carnage, the sea of black banners parted as Jarl Ragnar emerged, a mountain of a man clad in rusted iron and the pelts of dire wolves. He roared a challenge that shook the very limestone shelves Freya had warned of. His massive great axe whistling through the air, Viggo met him halfway, a streak of silver and fur, his longsword clashing against the axe with a shower of sparks that momentarily outshone the rising sun. From her command post on the ridge, Freya watched the duel with her heart in her throat. The inevitable history she had memorized was a dark one. Here, in the original timeline, Ragnar was supposed to break Viggo's guard and cleave through the Lykenos line. But history was a living thing, and she was currently holding the pen. "Archers!" Freya's voice rang out, no longer the hesitant tone of a librarian, but the sharp command of a strategist. "Ignore the center. Target the eastern scree slope. 11 o'clock. High elevation. On my mark." Gunnar, bloodied and panting, looked up at her. He didn't hesitate. "You heard the prophetess. Aim for the stone, not the meat." A cloud of arrows took flight, arcing through the freezing mist. They didn't strike Ragnar's men. They struck the unstable limestone shelves Freya had identified days ago. The vibration of the impact, combined with the structural weakness of the Thor, triggered a localized secondary collapse. A roar of cascading stone thundered down, not on the main army, but precisely on Ragnar's elite reinforcements, who were rushing to aid their chieftain. The sudden roar of the earth distracted Ragnar for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Viggo needed. Viggo ducked beneath a murderous swing of the axe, the air from the weapon's passage ruffling his hair. With a primal shout that channeled the strength of every alpha ancestor before him, he drove his blade upward. The steel found the gap in Ragnar's gorget, piercing deep. The giant froze, the light fading from his eyes as he looked up at the ridge, at the small modern woman who had seen his death coming from 1,000 years away. As Ragnar's body hit the slush with a heavy thud, a collective gasp rippled through the Bloodfang ranks. The unstoppable king was dead. The inevitable massacre had been averted. Viggo stood over his fallen foe, chest heaving, before turning his gaze toward the ridge. He raised his bloodied sword toward Freya in a silent, thunderous salute. The timeline had been severed. The great sorrow was gone, replaced by a victory that had never existed in any book. A new history written in the blood of the tyrant and the brilliance of the scholar. The heavy iron gates of the capital did not groan as they opened. They sang, a resonant bronze chord that heralded the return of a king and the arrival of a legend. The city of Lykenos was no longer a place of fearful shadows and boarded windows. Instead, the air was thick with the scent of roasting meat, evergreen boughs, and the jubilant roar of a people who had been promised a massacre but were given a miracle. At the head of the column, Freya rode beside Viggo. She was no longer wearing the synthetic fibers of her old world, which had long since been shredded by the briars of the Serpent's Pass. She was draped in velvet, the color of the midnight sky, and furs that bore the scent of the man who had claimed her. The modern watch on her wrist had stopped weeks ago, its battery dead, but she found she no longer reached for it to check the time. In this world, time wasn't measured in digital seconds, but in the lengthening shadows of the mountains and the rhythmic beat of a heart that finally felt synchronized with her own. Inside the great hall, the coronation was not merely a political formality, but a soul-deep recognition. As Astrid placed the circlet of woven silver and iron upon Freya's brow, the ancient mage leaned in, her milky eyes bright with a rare, knowing smile. "The ink has dried, traveler," she whispered. "The story is yours now." The festivities lasted deep into the night, but eventually, the clamor of the mead hall faded, replaced by the crackle of a private hearth in the royal solar. Freya stood by the window, looking out at the stars, constellations she now knew by their ancient primal names. A heavy pair of arms wrapped around her waist, and the familiar grounding heat of Viggo pressed against her back. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath a warm caress against the mark he had left there, the permanent seal of the Alpha on his queen. "You are thinking of the quiet place again," Viggo murmured, his voice a sleepy, contented rumble, "the room with the cold lights and the silent books." Freya turned in his arms, her fingers tracing the new scar on his jaw, a physical record of the history they had changed together. She thought of her quiet apartment, the humming archives, and the clinical isolation of her old life. It felt like a dream she had had once, a story she had read in a book that had finally been closed. "No," Freya said, a soft, certain smile touching her lips as she leaned into his strength. "I was thinking that I spent my whole life searching for history in dusty basements, never realizing that I was just looking for a way to find you. I didn't fall into a war, Viggo. I fell home." As he captured her lips in a kiss that promised 1,000 years of tomorrows, Freya realized the De Bellis Fae hadn't been a curse or a trap. It had been a map, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just studying the past. She was the one writing the future.